Good morning. Live from Columbia, South America. This is Knowledge Time. Welcome, alchemists. Today I'll be reading from the book The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. I'm currently in Chapter 6, Elevate Your Perspective, The Law of Shortsightedness, Part 1, Moments of Madness. It is in the animal part of your nature to be most impressed by what you can see and hear in the present, the latest news reports and trends, the opinions and actions of the people around you, whatever seemed the most dramatic. This is what makes you fall for alluring schemes that promise quick results and easy money. This is also what makes you overreact to present circumstances, becoming overly exhilarated by panicky as events turn one direction or the other. Learn to measure people by the narrowness or breadth of their vision, avoiding entangling yourself with those who cannot see the consequences of their actions, who are in a continual reactive mode. They will infect you with this energy. Your eyes must be on the larger trends that govern events, on that which is not immediately visible. Never lose sight of your long-term goals with an elevated perspective. You will have the patience and clarity to reach almost any objective. Moments of Madness. All through the summer and early fall of 1719, the Englishman John Blunt, 1665 to 1733, one of the lead directors of the South Sea Company, followed the latest news from Paris with increasing anxiety. The French were in the midst of a spectacular economic boom, fueled primarily by the success of the Mississippi Company, an enterprise started by the expatriate Scotsman John Law to exploit the riches in the Louisiana territories controlled by the French. Law sold shares in the company, and as its price kept rising, Frenchmen of all classes were cashing out and becoming fabulously wealthy. The word millionaire itself was coined in these months to refer to such novex riches. Such news made Blunt angry and envious. He was a loyal Englishman. With the success of the Mississippi Company, Paris was drawing in investment capital from all over Europe. If this continued, France would soon become the finance capital of the world, surpassing Amsterdam and London. Such newfound power for the French could only spell disaster for England, its arch enemy, particularly if another war broke out between them. More personally, Blunt was a man of great ambition. He was the son of a humble shoemaker. From early on in his life, he aimed to ascend to the highest levels of English society. His means of getting there, he believed, would be through the financial revolution sweeping Europe, which centered on the increasing popularity of joint stock corporations like Law's and like the South Sea Company, as opposed to building wealth through the traditional means of owning land, which was expensive to manage and highly taxable. It was relatively easy to earn money through purchasing stock, and profits were tax-free. Such investments were all the rage in London. Blunt had plans to turn the South Sea Company into the biggest and most prosperous joint stock company in Europe. But John Law had stolen his thunder with a bold venture, and with the full backing of the French government, Blunt would simply have to come up with something bigger and better for his sake and for the future of England. The South Sea Company had been formed in 1710 as an enterprise that would handle and manage part of the English government's enormous debts, in exchange for which the company was to be granted a monopoly on all English trade with South America. Over the years, the company did almost no trading but served as an informal bank for the government. Through his leadership of the company, Blunt had forged relationships with the wealthiest and most powerful Englishmen, most notably King George the 1660 to 1727 himself, who became one of its biggest investors and was named governor of the company. Blunt's motto in life had always been think big, and it had served him well. And so, as he racked his brain for a way to outdo the French, he finally hit upon a scheme in October of 1719 that was worthy of his motto, and that he left certain would change the course of history. The greatest problem facing the English government, headed by the king, was the massive debts it had incurred over the course of 30 years during the wars that had been fought with France and Spain, all financed through borrowing. Blunt's proposal was simple and quite astounding. The South Sea Company would pay the government a nice fee in order to completely take over the debt, valued at a whopping 31 million. The company would receive in exchange an annual interest payment on the debt. The company would then privatize this 31 million debt and sell it as if it were a commodity. As shares in the South Sea Company, one share equaling 100 pounds of debt. Those who had lent the government money could convert their IOUs into equivalent shares in the South Sea Company. The shares that were left over would be sold to the public. The price for one share would start at 100 pounds. As with any stock, the price could rise and fall. But in this case, if played right, the price would only go up. The South Sea Company had an intriguing name and held out the possibility that it would also begin trading in the vast wealth in South America. It was also the patriotic duty of English creditors to participate in the scheme, since they would be helping to cancel the debt while potentially making much more money than the annual interest payments the government paid them. If the share price rose, as it almost certainly would, buyers could cash out for a profit and the company could afford to pay nice dividends. Like magic, debt could be transformed into wealth. This would be the answer to all of the government's problems, and it would assure Blunt lasting fame. When King George first heard of Blunt's proposal in November of 1719, he was quite confused. He could not understand how such a negative debt could be instantly turned into a positive. Besides, this new jargon of finance went straight over his head. But Blunt spoke with such conviction that he found himself swept up in his enthusiasm. After all, he was promising to solve George's two greatest problems in one fell swoop, and it was hard to resist such a prospect. King George was massively unpopular, one of the most unpopular English kings of all time. It was not totally his fault. He was not English by birth, but German. His title previously had been the Duke of Brunswick and Elector of Hanover. When Queen Anne of England died in 1714, George was her closest living Protestant relative. But the moment he ascended the throne, his new subjects found him not to their liking. He spoke English with a horrific accent, and his manners were so coarse, and he was always avid for more money. Despite his advanced age, he was constantly chasing after women other than his wife, none of whom were particularly attractive. In the first years of his reign, there were several coup attempts, and the public might have welcomed the change if they had succeeded. George desperately wanted to prove to his new subjects that he could be a great king in his own way, that he hated most of all was the crushing debts the government had incurred before he ascended the throne. George had an almost allergic reaction to any kind of debt, as if his own blood were being leached. Now here was Blunt offering him the chance to cancel the debt and bring prosperity to England, strengthening the monarchy in the process. It was almost too good to be true, and he threw his full full weight behind the proposal. He assigned the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Aislabie, the task of presenting the proposal to Parliament in January 1720. Parliament would have to approve it in the form of a bill. Almost immediately, Blunt's proposal stirred up fierce opposition among several MPs, some of whom found it ludicrous. But in the weeks after Islabille's speech, opponents of the bill watched in dismay as support for their side slowly withered away. Advance shares in the venture had been virtually gifted to the wealthiest and most powerful Englishmen, including prominent members of Parliament, who, sensing the sheer profits they personally would gain, now gave their approval to the bill. When the bill passed in April of that year, King George himself showed up at the South Sea House and deposited £100,000 for shares in the new venture. He wanted to display his confidence in it, but such a step was hardly necessary, as the build-up to the bill's passage had captured the public, and interest in South Sea Company shares had already reached a fever pitch. The center of activity was an area of London known as Exchange Alley, where almost all stocks were sold. Now the narrow streets in and around the alley were clogged with traffic, growing thicker by the day. At first, it was mostly the wealthy and influential who came in their fancy coaches to buy up shares. Among the buyers were also artists and intellectuals, including John Gay, Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift. Soon, Sir Isaac Newton felt the pull and invested a good chunk of his savings, £7,000. A few weeks later, however, he felt doubt. The price was rising, but what rises can surely fall. And so he cashed out, doubling his initial investment. Soon rumors began to circulate that the company was about to initiate trade in South America, where all kinds of riches lay buried in the mountains. This only added fuel to the fire, and people from all classes began to converge on London to buy up shares in the South Sea Company. Blunt, it was reported, was a financial alchemist who had found the secret of transforming debt into wealth. In the countryside, farmers pulled from under their beds their life savings in coins and sent their sons and nephews to buy as many shares as possible. The fever spread to women of all classes who normally did not dabble in such things. Now actresses were rubbing elbows with duchesses in Exchange Alley. All the while, the price kept rising, over £300 and soon £400. Like France before it, the country was not experiencing a spectacular boom. On May 28th, the king celebrated his 60th birthday, and for someone who had been known for his frugality, it was the most lavish party anyone had ever seen, with enormous tubs full of claret and champagne. One woman at the party flaunted her new wealth by encrusting her dress with jewels worth over £5,000. Everywhere in London, the wealthy were tearing down mansions and replacing them with houses that were even larger and grander. Porters and footmen were now quitting their jobs and buying expensive coaches and hiring porters and footmen of their own. One young actress made such a fortune, she decided to retire. She rented out an entire theater to say goodbye to her adoring fans. As aristocratic lady was astonished one evening at the opera to see that her former maid now occupied a more expensive box in the theater than her own, Jonathan Swift wrote in a letter to a friend, I have inquired of some that have come from London, What is the religion there? They tell me it is South Sea stock. What is the policy of England? The answer is the same. What is the trade? South Sea steel. And what is the business? Nothing but South Sea. In the midst of this feverish buying and selling spree, there stood John Blunt at the pump, doing whatever he possibly could to stimulate the interest in South Sea shares and keep the prices rising. He sold the stock in various subscriptions, offering generous terms of payment, sometimes requiring only a 20% advance to get it. For every £400 invested, Blunt would lend £300. He wanted to keep up the demand and make people feel that they might be missing out on their one chance for wealth. Soon the price had passed £500 and kept on rising. On June 15, he had set the subscription price at an astronomical £1,000, with only 10% down to get in and 10% installments spread out over 4 years. Few could resist such terms. That very month, King George had Blunt knighted. Now a baronet, Sir John Blunt stood at the pinnacle of English society. Yes, he was rather unattractive to look at, and he could be quite pompous, but he had made so many people so wealthy that he was now England's most cherished celebrity. As the rich and powerful prepared to leave London for the summer months, the mood was downright giddy. Blunt affected a confident and carefree air, but underneath it he was beginning to feel worried, even panicky. There were so many things he had fallen to foresee. He had inadvertently inspired a rash of new speculative ventures, some involving legitimate ideas and some patently absurd, such as the development of a wheel of perpetual motion. People were now feeling the fever and were pouring some of their money into these joint stock companies. Every £1 of cash that went into these was £1 less that people had to spend on the South Sea Company. And that was a growing problem, since there was only so much cash in England, and there were limits to how far he could go by offering credit. Similarly, people were beginning to pour their money into land as a safe investment for the future, often cashing out their South Sea stock for such purposes. Blunt himself had been doing that very thing, unbeknownst to the public. More troubling still, the French had lost faith in the Mississippi venture and were pulling out their money. Cash had become scarce, and the French economy had now fallen into a sudden depression. This would certainly affect the mood in London. Before people returned from their summer holidays, Blunt had to take action. Working with Parliament, he got past the Bubble Act of 1720, which banned all joint stocks not authorized by royal charter. This would put an end to rampant speculation. But his solution created consequences he did not foresee. Thousands of people had poured their savings into these new businesses, and as these were now outlawed, they had no way of getting their money back. Their only recourse was to sell South Sea shares. Many of those who had used credit to buy South Sea shares saw themselves facing installments they could no longer afford. They tried to cash out as well. The price of South Sea shares began to fall. That August, crowds were forming outside the South Sea House as people felt desperate to sell. Near the end of August, Blunt became desperate himself. He decided to launch his fourth money subscription once again at £1,000. Now the terms were even more generous than ever, and on top of it, he was promising an astoundingly large Christmas dividend of 30%, to be followed by an annual dividend of 50%. Some were pulled back into the scheme by such alluring terms. including Sir Isaac Newton himself, but others, as if waking up from a dream, began to wonder about the whole thing. How could a company that had not traded for anything yet in South America, whose only tangible asset was the interest the government paid it on its debt, afford to dish out such large dividends? Now, what had seemed like alchemy or magic appeared to be a downright hoax on the public. By early September, the selling off had turned into a panic, as almost everyone rushed to convert paper shares into something real, into coin or metal of any kind. As the panic for cash accelerated, the Bank of England was nearly brought down. It came close to running out of currency. It was now clear in England that the party was over. Many had lost their fortunes and life savings in the sudden downfall. Isaac Newton himself had lost £20,000, and from then on, the mere mention of finance or banks would make him ill. People were trying to sell whatever they could. Soon there was a wave of suicides, including that of Charles Blunt, Sir John's nephew, who slashed her throat after learning the exact nature of his losses. Blunt himself had hounded in the streets and nearly killed by an assassin. He had to quickly escape London. He spent the rest of his life in the town of Bath, scraping by on the very modest means still left to him after Parliament seized almost all of the money he had earned through the South Sea scheme. Perhaps in his isolation he could contemplate the irony of it all. He had indeed changed the course of history and assured his fame for all time as the man who had conjured up one of the most absurd and destructive schemes ever devised in the history of business. Interesting. Interpretation. John Blunt was a pragmatic, hard-nosed businessman with a single goal: to make a lasting fortune for himself and his family. In the summer of 1719, however, his highly realistic man caught a fever of sorts. When he began to read about what was going on in Paris, he was struck by the drama of it all. He read vivid stories about average Frenchmen suddenly making fortunes. He had never thought prior to this that investments in joint stock companies could yield such quick results. But the evidence from France was irrefutable. He wanted to bring similar good fortune to England, and in crafting his plan, he naturally imitated many of the features of law schemes, only increasing the scale of it. What is striking here, however, is that one rather obvious question never seemed to cross his mind. The scheme would depend on the share price rising. If those who converted their government IOUs into shares had to pay £200 per share instead of £100, they would receive fewer shares, which would leave more shares for South Sea to sell to the public and make a nice profit. If the shares were purchased at £200, they were now worth more if the price continued to rise and were sold at some point. Seeing the price rise would lure more creditors to convert their shares and more people to buy in. Everyone would win only if the price kept rising. But how could the price keep rising if it was not based on any real assets, such as trade? If the price started to fall, as it inevitably would, panic would certainly set in, since people would lose faith in the scheme, and this could only set off a chain reaction of selling. How could Blunt not have foreseen this? The answer is simple. Blunt's mental time frame had shrunk to the point where he lost the ability to look months down the road and consider consequences. Mesmerized by events in France and imagining all of the wealth and power he was on the verge of attaining, he could focus only on the present, making sure the scheme launched successfully. Its initial success only made him imagine it would trend this way for a long time. As it progressed, he certainly understood that he had to make the price rise even more quickly. and the only means of doing so was to lure in more investors through generous terms of credit. This would make the scheme even more precarious, one solution incurring several new dangers. The Bubble Act and the generous dividends carried even greater immediate risks. But by now his time frame had shrunk to a matter of days. If only he could keep the ship afloat another week, he could find some new solution. Finally, he ran out of time. When people lose the connection between their actions and their consequences, they lose their hold on reality. And the further this goes, the more it looks like madness. The madness that overcame Blunt soon infected the king, the parliament, and eventually an entire nation of citizens renowned for their common sense. Once the English saw their compatriots making large sums of money, it became a fact. The scheme had to be a success. They too lost the ability to think a few months ahead. Look at what happened to Sir Isaac Newton, paragon of rationality. In the beginning, he too caught the fever, but after a week, his logical mind could see the holes in the scheme, and so he sold his shares. Then he watched others making much larger sums of money than his paltry £14,000, and it bothered him. By August, he had to get back in, even though it was the absolute worst time to reinvest. Sir Isaac Newton himself had lost the ability to think past the day, as one Dutch banker observed of the scene in Exchange Alley. It resembled nothing as much as if all the lunatics had escaped out of the madhouse at once. Understand, we humans tend to live in the moment. It is the animal part of our nature. We respond first and foremost to what we see and hear, to what is most dramatic in an event. But we are not merely animals tied to the present. Human reality encompasses the past. Every event is connected to something that happened before in an endless chain of historical causation. Any present problem has deep roots in the past. It also encompasses the future. Whatever we do has consequences that stretch far into the years to come. When we limit our thinking to what our senses provide, to what is immediate, we descend to the pure animal level in which our reasoning powers are neutralized. We are no longer aware of why or how things come about. We imagine that some successful scheme that has lasted a few months can only get better. We no longer give thought to the possible consequences of anything we set in motion. We react to what is given in the moment, based on only a small piece of the puzzle. Naturally, our actions then lead to unintended consequences, or even to disasters like the South Sea crash or the more recent crash of 2008. To complicate matters, we are surrounded by others who are continually reacting, drawing us deeper into the present. Salesmen and demagogues play on our weakness in human nature to con us with the prospect of easy gains and instant gratification. Our only antidote is to train ourselves to continually detach from the immediate rush of events and elevate our perspective. Instead of merely reacting, we step back and look at the wider context. We consider the various possible ramifications of any actions we take. We keep in mind our long-term goals, often in raising our perspective. We will decide that it is better to do nothing and to not react, and to let time go by and see what it reveals. If Blunt had only waited a few months, he would have seen Law's scheme falling apart, and London and England would have been spared the ruin that came. Such sanity and balance do not come naturally. They are powers we acquire through great effort, and they represent the height of human wisdom. I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people. Sir Isaac Newton. In conclusion, subscribe to the channel, comment any questions you have, like if the information was inspiring for you, and share this knowledge with other alchemists. Also, follow me on Instagram for more progressive knowledge. You can catch me at Max_Bugatti_8008. I'm all about family first. I'm a global stock investor. I'm a filmmaker. I'm an aerospace botanist. I have a masculine confidence building program. And currently, I'm out here in Cali, Colombia. While you're slaying dragons, I'll be taming them.